The military knows all about medical triage. When you have too many soldiers to treat and not enough surgeons and physicians to treat them, you have to make tough decisions about who actually is going to receive the care. And usually those decisions are based on the prognosis of the patient, such that those who would only survive if they receive the care are given the care. Those who are going to die anyway are allowed to die. Those who are going to live anyway, their care is postponed. But those who need urgent care now to survive, who would otherwise die, for whom the care is both necessary and sufficient, they receive it. It's March 22nd, 2020, and I feel like I need to make that disclaimer as I record this because the coronavirus pandemic is changing so much. Who knows how this thing will play out? Who knows how much it'll change in the next month or so? But up until this point, we already know that Italy has been hit very hard, and it's the case that they've had to make difficult rationing decisions with their ventilators for patients that need it. They've got more patients that need a ventilator to live than they have ventilators. I understand it's the case that Spain is getting into a similar circumstance, and New York is expecting this to happen there as well. The cases are skyrocketing. They only have so many medical resources. They've called up the National Guard. They're bringing in additional ventilators, but it's the case that experts believe we're going to have more people who need this care than we're going to have care to provide. And so tough decisions are going to have to be made. So I found a couple of articles that I think will be relevant to this and help inform our decisions. The first is Pandemic Ventilator Rationing and Appeals Processes by Daniel Patrone and David Resnik. And this was actually written back in 2010 under the auspices of how to treat ventilator rationing under a influenza pandemic. And the other is The Dynamics and Ethics of Triage, Rationing Care in Hard Times by Major Thomas B. Rapine, I believe of the Marine Corps, if I'm reading this correctly. The first article, Pandemic Ventilator Rationing and Appeals Processes, led to an unexpected conclusion. When I read the title, I thought that the appeals process that they were going to lay out would tell us exactly how it should be articulated, what moral norms should inform the appeals process, how this is going to improve the decisions in different ways. But instead, the authors actually argue against an appeals process on grounds largely that it's unnecessary to promote justice and fairness, and also on grounds that if we were to have an appeals process such that patients and patients' loved ones could say, hey, I was denied a ventilator, but really I should receive one because you're not considering this, or my mother should receive a ventilator, and you're denying her one, even though blah, blah, blah. They argued that if we were to allow that, it would invite confrontations with the medical community, it would undermine the authority of physicians, and most importantly, it would make the process inefficient, such that more people would die while we're arguing over how the ventilators should be allocated than if we were just to go ahead and allocate them the best that we can. That's the argument anyway, or largely what the argument is. They consider an interesting side point at the outset of the argument, or the outset of the article, that medical professionals and healthcare professionals on the front lines of any pandemic should be given first priority when it comes to rationing care in this way, and ventilators in particular, on grounds of reciprocity. And all that means is that, hey, they're the ones coming to work, putting themselves at risk. If they were to become seriously ill and require a ventilator, who else would deserve one more than the person who is trying to cure others, the doctors and the nurses and all the healthcare professionals who actually took that risk and came to work to help everybody else. Another consequentialist argument, which the authors don't consider, but that could be added to this, is that if you tell healthcare professionals that, hey, if any of you have a meeting, if any of you need a ventilator, you've got first dibs on the ventilators because you're the ones here risking your necks. If you need it, we're going to provide you the very best care. That would incentivize them to come to work. My mother works part-time for a healthcare group here in East Tennessee, and she was asked yesterday to come to work next week, so she got a week in advance. And initially she thought, yeah, I can go to work, I'll just be careful. I talked her out of this because she is 75. Maybe if she had been told, Carol, if you get sick, we're going to give you the very best care, we're going to give you a ventilator if you need one. Maybe if she'd been told that would have put her mind at rest and mine as well. It would have not, because it wouldn't have, because she's 75. But perhaps for the younger, healthier healthcare professionals, that would give them extra reason an extra reassurance to go ahead and come to work. So just an additional argument to add to the authors, which was kind of a side argument apart from the general rationing appeals process argument that they provide. And they consider arguments from several different philosophers on why an appeals process should be included. Norman Daniels, for example, argues that it would improve the justice and the legitimacy of the process. It would make it more democratic if people could appeal for their own ventilator care and for their loved ones, and if even outside people could come in and review the decisions. But the authors argue that the process can be just and legitimate enough if clear criteria are already set up and agreed to, and if they're carefully and intelligently followed. And so we don't actually need that additional intervention, which could slow the process down, to reach an adequate level of justice. I think it would be the case that it would make the process, if designed well, it wouldn't be too much of a draw on efficiency, and it would indeed improve the justice and the legitimacy and the transparency, etc. But they argue that it's not necessary, and I guess the trade-offs would be too bad. They consider another argument from Honora O'Neill, and I just previewed this, and she argues that if an appeals process were followed, that this would make it more transparent, and this would improve trust between the community at large and patients in particular, and the healthcare system and perhaps the government insofar as they're involved in these sorts of decisions through regulations and whatnot. But the authors argue that in similar cases where transparency has been promoted, it has had, quote, mixed results at best, meaning that the trust didn't necessarily improve whenever rationing decisions were made public and an appeals process was invited or incorporated. I would think that if you made a decision-making process transparent and trust decreased, that would suggest that the process was somehow flawed. That would suggest that mistakes were being made, or people weren't following the agreed-upon criteria, or the criteria themselves were questionable. And so to say that you've had mixed success at best when transparency has been promoted through an appeals process, that's not very reassuring. That suggests, I would think, that we should go ahead and be transparent and have appeals, and trust will go up if the process is deserving of that additional trust. And if it's not, it'll go down, and it won't be a bad thing because it'll give the system additional reason to get it right. But anyway, that's the way the authors argue. And then last, they consider the argument that the decisions themselves might be better, might be of higher quality if there's an appeals process and more accountability in this way. And the authors argue that it's just going to be the case that it'll be too late. We couldn't make the process any better through appeals because patients' conditions will change. For example, if the ethics board or the head surgeon decides, patient X, you receive a ventilator. Patient Y, you do not receive a ventilator. And then later on that evening, they have a meeting to review the decisions made and the decision-making process. And the group agrees that patient Y should have received the ventilator and not patient X. Well, it could be the case that by now, patient X is fully dependent upon the ventilator and now meets the threshold criteria to receive it, and patient Y's condition may have worsened so much that switching the ventilator wouldn't do them any good. And so the authors are really arguing that it would be ineffective to have an appeals process in terms of improving the quality because patients' conditions would change so much. I would think that the fact that bad decisions may be irreversible wouldn't be reason to not evaluate and reassess bad decisions and correct them when possible. Sure, it's the case that a patient their condition could deteriorate so much that they wouldn't be helped. And sure, it could be the case that another patient's situation would become medically dependent upon a ventilator and unable to remove it. But perhaps by evaluating that decision-making process, you decide that the next available ventilator is going to go to patient Y. So I'm not so sure the author's argument works in that particular case. So they overall argue that having an appeals process is ineffective. They argue on additional grounds that they don't want to undermine physicians and the hospital system's authority. They seem to be conflict averse. They say, quote, appeals, quote, may serve to create unnecessary and potentially hostile confrontations among staff and patients for their advocates or within the staff itself. Just because there may be confrontation isn't reason to really want to get the decision right. But that's one additional reason. One of the real arguments behind this, the real points, is that it would just be inefficient. We need to make those hasty decisions in the name of, maybe not hasty, we need to make quick decisions in the name of saving the most lives possible, and an appeals process might slow things down. But then they also invoke this idea that the military triage culture should govern the decisions here. And they say, quote, they want to defer to that culture. They say quote, allowing the triage officers' good faith decisions to be challenged by those who stand to lose access to life-saving treatment undermines his or her decision-making authority and the ability of the system to respond to a crisis situation effectively. So now we're going to turn to this other article by Major Thomas Rapine, and I'll give you a preview of that. And he argues that triage, and he explains that triage is used in many different circumstances, not just on the battlefield, such as in admitting. If you've ever been to the hospital, to the emergency room, or the emergency department, you're going to meet a clerk, and the clerk is going to they're going to ask you first what's wrong, and then, depending on the severity and their initial analysis of just looking at you or your child or whoever you brought to the hospital, they're going to say, either go have a seat or come back here right away. I've been in situations where they said, come back here right away. The vast majority of the time they say, go have a seat, fill out this paperwork, and then you wait for the more critically injured and in more dire need patients to be seen. It's the case that this happens in catastrophes. The author mentions 9/11, I believe, if not this one, the other two do. In intensive care units, that care is rationed based on need and the fact that whether or not it'll actually do some good. Waiting lists for organ transplants, that's also based on, among other things, necessity. But also, and this was initially developed on the battlefield. Major Rapine argues that soldiers and civilians alike intuitively accept that triage is morally appropriate. He says, quote, individual patients normally recognize that their sprained ankle should not be treated when the doctor is treating a patient with a heart attack. I actually put a typo in my own notes, that's why I had to pause there. But the thrust of the sentence was that if you got a sprained ankle and this person's been shot in the head, you're okay with waiting until they've been treated, unless it means they're going to die anyway, in which case they should still at least try because it's just a sprained ankle. But if it's a heart attack, yes, that's immediate. You can help them, get the defib out, do CPR, whatever you need to do. My ankle can wait. Take care of them, give me some ice and something to watch on the waiting room television. But he also argues that when demand outstrips resources, quote, patients with the greatest chance of survival with the least expenditure of time, equipment, supplies, and personnel are treated first. So you want to treat the treatable who need it, the patients for whom the care is both necessary and sufficient, needed to live and able to save them, and the decision-making process is, are you going to live anyway, regardless of whether you get care? Your care is deferred. Are you going to die anyway, regardless of whether you receive care? Your care is deferred. Are you only going to live if you receive the care now? Come on back. Let's treat you, because we only have so many surgeons, so many ER docs, so many ventilators. And so the overall argument from Patrone and Resnik is that we should take this military triage approach, and also its deference to the triage officer, that their decisions are final and they ought not be contested out of respect for the chain of command, and also just because oftentimes military members in a unit, as Rapine argues, they are more than willing to defer their care out of the interests of their fellow soldiers' care. They don't want to be treated. They want their battle buddies to be treated first, regardless of their injuries. And the author cites several different instances where that's been witnessed, and it's of no surprise that soldiers would be willing to sacrifice in this way. Whether civilians in peacetime who just happen to catch a virus would be similarly willing to defer their care is very doubtful. But the authors, again, ultimately argue that this appeals process should not be included, largely out of the name of, in the name of efficiency, but also to avoid those confrontations, and because they think that the process can be good enough if we have a smart criteria and decision-making process set up on the front end. And they also advocate for regular reviews of those decisions, but those reviews would be for proactive decisions, not retroactive. It wouldn't be a review of decisions because we may go back and change the way those ventilators were allocated, but instead how we might influence future decisions. However, you're free and welcome and encouraged to evaluate this however you like, but I don't think an appeals process would necessarily have to be inefficient. I can imagine some sort of a simple form that a person could fill out. I could imagine a list of hospital personnel who could be on some sort of a ventilator rationing review board or appeals board. I could imagine a medical ethicist at a hospital. Many hospitals employ medical ethicists to be on that board. I could envision them actually reviewing cases typed up. There could be a clerk that types up the key details, that they input the information from the appeal. The physician that made the initial rationing decision types up his or her explanation, and then the group evaluates this, and if any changes need to be made, if they would make a medical difference, they would be made. So I wouldn't think it would necessarily be inefficient. And the improvement in justice and fairness and probably the quality of the decisions as well, I think would be enough if you could make it efficient enough to not worry about the potential drop-off in efficiency. We definitely want to get it right. I've found, and maybe you have as well, and this isn't always the case, but sometimes physicians in particular, they're used to making these difficult life or death decisions. And sometimes the fact that they've had practice at that and the fact that they've had to suffer the burden of making such difficult decisions makes them feel like they're the only person qualified to make that kind of decisions. Not that kind of a decision. Not always the case, but sometimes you get the impression that they think my decisions are above reproach, and you've never had to make these sort of tough calls, and therefore I should not be questioned. No one else should insert their thinking into this, or even raise the possibility that I might have made a mistake. But in the name of getting this right, in the name of reassuring the public that the right decision is being made in a fair way, I think that an efficient appeals process could be instituted. However, I'm just a mere philosopher. I don't have direct access to how dire the situation is, how much of a drag this could be on the system. And so ultimately I would defer to the input of many professionals in a better position to make those sorts of calls. But I hope the reasons I've given today, using these authors' articles, would help make a good decision there. Thanks as always.